I cannot speak for the IMF, but I can certainly walk you through our numbers. They have an estimate of 30 million, which is quite close to ours of 35 million. And what I'd like to point out here is that that number is actually the additional number of people that would be plunged into poverty as a result of the crisis. So that would take the total number of people living in subsistence living to around 470 million rand, 470 million today. How did we arrive at that number? It's quite simple, really, if you think about how forceful the COVID-19 shock was. In fact, it was so forceful that it plunged the region into its first recession in 25 years. We saw a contraction of around 2% in GDP. And if you translate that into livelihoods or how you see people then being drawn into poverty, if you think about Africa, a lot of people, most economies have a very informal structure. And right when the pandemic hit, we had these very forceful lockdowns, really. And what that meant is that people were unable to go out and go out on the streets and work. If you ran a business, you were unable to operate. And if you had a job, you might have lost it. And why we saw such a stark, or why we have such a stark number in Africa in particular, also reflects government's response to the pandemic. What we saw in advanced economies was quite a forceful or very strong fiscal response, about 10% of GDP. But African governments had quite elevated debt levels, which prevented them from being able to provide a similar response. So we saw a response of around 0.5% of GDP. And if you want to compare that in dollar terms, you're looking at about a 7,000 USD sort of response in advanced economies versus less than $50 in Africa. And that shows you how, you stop people from working or being able to earn an income, and you can't compensate for that. And so we saw 35 million more people being plunged into poverty as a result of the crisis.
Indeed, and also as part of your modelling, you're forecasting it will still likely have 500 million people under the poverty line by 2030 as well. I guess the main question here would be, walk us through how this pandemic is sticky in terms of making it much harder for people to recover from the income shocks that they dealt with in 2020 and 2021.
Correct. Thank you very much for that question. So you are right. So we have 30 million more people being plunged into poverty, 2020, 2021. And by the end of 2030, of course, you're able to close some of that gap, but you still have 25 million more people living in poverty. And the reason for that is you have a persistent, let's call it loss in income. I've already spoken about the fact that governments were unable to provide a similar response. Another reason we're seeing in the region is the fact that, our vaccination rates have pretty much lagged the rest of the world. So you're looking, today, less than 10% of African populations are partially vaccinated, and this compares with over 50% for the rest of the world. And the impact of that is that Africa will be unable to reopen its economies at the same pace as the rest of the world. Another reason is that we have quite elevated debt levels. So yes, we will recover, but a huge share of our revenues thereafter will be used to service rising debt service costs, even after the pandemic effects sort of fade. And in short, you have a permanent loss of income that's not recovered, and we estimate that to be about roughly 5%, really because of the scarring or the permanent damage that the pandemic has inflicted on most economies. We expect a full recovery, I think, in about 4 years' time, sort of back to the pre-pandemic level. And that just shows you how slowly Africa is recovering relative to the rest of the world. Advanced markets will be back this year, early next year at the latest.
Let's talk about one of those. Let's talk about one of those advanced markets, China. You argue it's a critical partner for future growth through trade and through investment as well. But we're seeing, at least in the last couple of years, we're seeing this slowdown in lending coming in through from China. Uganda, for example, is looking for funding for its standard gauge rail line. That hasn't happened. Kenya is looking for funding for the second leg of its standard gauge rail line. That hasn't come through. So is the thesis that, we're still going to have China funding a significant part of the infrastructure development that's needed across the continent? Does that still hold true?
Yes, we still stand by that thesis. And yes, you are correct that lending has slowed down. But if you look at the total debt portfolio in Africa, it's still the biggest lender in the region. At the same time, let's call it its ties with the region have also increased quite significantly. So we had overall trade with China around 4% at the beginning of the decade at around 2000. And that's up to 20% now. So we think China remains quite heavily invested in the region. And we think the slowdown that you're seeing actually reflects, shall we call it, an improvement in the quality of lending. I think we've had varied experiences across the continent with lending in China. And I think China is now a little bit more selective about the kinds of projects it's investing in. I think it's tightening its lending terms. Sorry. And yeah, I think that's part of the reasons we're seeing for the slowdown. But also China remains, sort of a lender of last resort, coming in always where there's more risk. And sorry, talking about the improvement in quality and maybe tighter selection criteria, I think China is also a little bit more hesitant to go in where you already have quite clear sort of debt problems. A good example here might be Angola, even Mozambique. And I think the projects you outlined might actually be suffering from some of those problems that I've outlined. So I think it's tighter selection rather than decreased appetite, if you will.
All right. And debt, of course, does seem to be the one common denominator weaving through this entire conversation. It's a sort of millstone that's holding back governments from being able to respond forcefully where they need to do so. But is there an argument for debt cancellation at this point in time, or is the moral hazard involved in that sort of thing just too great?
Look, this is a very, very good question. The international community's response to Africa's debt burden has been the debt suspension initiative, as you know. We think this is a really good and quick way to free up resources. But a big problem with that program has been that the funding that's channeled has actually been to the most indebted countries. Rather than those who are most in need or those that were most affected by the crisis. And a good example here is Angola. It's not even a DSSA country, but it was the biggest beneficiary of the program. So to answer your question, I'd like to propose an alternative. Our view is actually that the international community should have given Africa net transfers, or put differently, sort of direct aid. And what that does is it compensates for the full effect of the pandemic. In other words, it puts African countries in no worse position than what they would have been had the pandemic not happened. And the benefit of the solution is that, one, you give sort of aid where it's most needed, but also you then don't run the risk or have the negative connotations associated with debt relief. We already had it in the early 2000s, and debt levels are back up to where they were sort of when we had that debt relief. So the advantage of this is that you still put countries in a position where they still have to exercise fiscal restraint. They still have to continue with the reforms that they had before, and there's no loss or fear of a ratings downgrade, or maybe not having access to the market as a result of participating in the program. And importantly, you also don't have the risk of moral hazard that you outlined. So the answer is, we think net transfers would have been the better solution rather than debt relief or even the DSSI program that we saw.